So I'm an Australian university student, and I come to Korea to see my parents because they moved here 2 years ago after every semester. So I've lived in Australia since age 1 until now, and I study there. And the issue that I'm facing is that I love Australia, but I keep feeling that I'm less Australian now compared to my peers and my friends because my new home is in Korea now. And I have to catch a plane to go home, and everyone else lives down the road. I'm facing a bit of an identity problem because of that as well. So I don't know how I should deal with that.
한국에서 태어나서 20년간 한국에서 자란 사람은 한국말을 잘하겠죠.
So if you're born in Korea and you were born and raised in Korea for over 20 years, then your Korean would be fluent, correct?
호주에서 태어나서 20년간 호주에서 자랐다면 영어를 잘하겠죠.
And if you're born in Australia and you were born and raised in Australia for over 20 years, then your English should be perfect.
한국에서 태어나서 10년간 살다가 호주에 가서 10년간 살았다. 이분은 한국말은 한국 사람보다 못하고 영어는 호주 사람보다 못하겠죠.
So if you're born in Korea and lived for 10 years, then you immigrated to Australia and lived there for another 10 years, your Korean would not be as good as Koreans living here, and your English is probably as not good as Australians who were born and raised there.
이럴 때 나는 한국말도 제대로 못하고 영어도 제대로 못한다. 이렇게 생각하는 사람 많습니다.
So at that point, a lot of people think that my Korean is not as good as Koreans, and my English is not as good as Australians, and they feel very self-critical.
근데 그걸 욕심이라 그래요.
And I think that's greed.
호주에서 10년밖에 안 살았기 때문에 호주에 20년 살은 사람보다 영어를 못하는 게 당연하잖아요.
So since you only lived in Australia for 10 years, your English is probably not as good, and it's obvious that it's not as good as somebody who was born and raised there for over 20 years.
한국에서 10년밖에 안 살았기 때문에 한국에서 20년 살은 사람보다 한국말 못하는 게 당연하잖아요.
And likewise, since you only lived in Korea until you're 10 years old, it's obvious and natural that your Korean is not as good as somebody who lived and raised here for over 20 years.
근데 왜 내가 한국말을 한국 사람만큼 해야 되고 영어를 호주 사람만큼 해야 된다고 생각합니까?
Then why do you think that your English should be as good as Australian or your Korean should be as good as Korean?
그래서 이럴 때는 이렇게 생각해야 합니다.
So then maybe you should try a different approach.
호주 사람 중에는 내가 한국말을 제일 잘하고 한국 사람 중에는 내가 영어를 제일 잘한다. 이렇게 생각하시죠.
Maybe you should approach it this way. Among the Australians, my Korean is the best, and among the Koreans, my Australian English is the best.
I think you misunderstood what I meant. So I've been living in Australia for my entire life. And I've never lived in Korea before. I only come to Korea to see my parents every 6 months because they moved here 2 years ago. So the issue that I'm facing is because I grew up Australian in a white neighborhood, because my home now is no longer in Australia, I feel less Australian compared to everyone that I've known before, and that has given me a bit of a identity crisis. So how should I deal with that problem?
제가 당신의 질문에 대답을 했는데
I actually did respond to your question.
I think you said that I lived in Korea for 10 years and I lived in Australia for 10 years. But that's not true. I've never lived in Korea before.
네, 그건 제가 for example 예를 들어서 설명합니다.
That was an example. That was not your case specifically.
당신의 부모는 한국 사람입니다.
But your parents are Korean.
호주에서 당신이 자랐다 하더라도.
So even though you were raised in Australia.
그렇기 때문에 당신은 이렇게 육체적으로 우선 한국 사람 모양이고요, 동양 사람 모양이고.
In that sense, your appearance is that of a Korean.
그다음에 어머니나 아버지가 한국말을 가끔 쓰기 때문에 당신은 어릴 때 영어가 이 호주 사람들 집안에 태어난 사람보다는 이렇게 영어가 조금 서투릅니다.
So, and since your parents probably spoke Korean sometimes at home, you didn't learn Australian English as quickly as your friends.
그리고 또 한국에 가끔 한국에 오기 때문에 호주 사람보다는 한국의 영향을 조금 더 받았습니다.
And because of your origin and because you visit Korea every 6 months or so, you're more likely to be influenced somewhat by Korean culture than Australians living in Australia.
그러니까 오스트리아 부모님에게 태어나서 오스트리아에서만 살고 한국을 접촉하지 않는 사람에 비해서 당신은 당연히 호주 사람이 되는데 1%, 2%가 부족해도 부족해할 수밖에 없습니다.
So for somebody, compare yourself to somebody who's fully Australian, everything Australian, very isolated from any other culture but Australia, in a sense you can see that you are a little bit of less Australian than that person.
이것은 자연스러움이지 않습니까?
And that's a natural state.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. Yeah, it's really good. Thank you so much.
저분께 제가 잠시 더 보충하겠습니다.
Okay.
So I'd like to actually follow up on the response to your question.
당신의 정체성은 오스트리아인 또는 코리안이 아니고 코리아 오스트리아인이에요.
So what I'm trying to say is that it's not a binary, your identity. Your identity is not either Korean or Australian. It's Korean Australian.
네, yes.
제3의 성입니다. 제3의 정체성이에요.
So you have a new identity that's fully your own.
남의 정체성에 비교해서 내 정체성을 찾으려고 하지 말고
So-
나는 나의 정체성을 가져야 합니다.
So do not try to discover or define your identity comparing yourself to other existing identity, but try to discover and own your own identity.
자기 정체성을 가지셨습니까?
Do you feel like you own your own identity?
I think that's the way to go. Yeah.